So once again, the Blues Doctor's office has gotten way backed up. So we're going to do an abbreviated version of the podcast this week. We have a couple of good stories from Charity Hospital and from another hospital that I was at. You'll have to listen to that to get what that one is. We'll have some live music also, and then we should be able to get back to a regular version of the podcast next week. So we're back at the pool on the Gulf Coast again, as you can see here in Orange Beach, Alabama. Looks nice. It's a little cool, but you can go in it if you want to. Anyway, that reminded me of another hospital I used to work at. Instead of Charity Hospital, I also worked at Los Angeles County Hospital. And those two hospitals were pretty similar, actually, in many ways. It was a big inner city indigent facility that was old and not well maintained and chronically underfunded and all that stuff. And they had people from all over the world as patients there. One difference is it was primarily Hispanic. About 85% or so of the Los Angeles County Hospital population spoke Spanish only. So you had to get pretty good at Spanish if you're a trainee there. It was kind of like being in an immersion course in a language. You got pretty good. All right, one day I was there as the fellow in oncology, and we had a patient who had recurrent cervical cancer. She was in her 30s, and she had a recurrence in the pelvis. So I had to go tell her the only treatment option we had for her was what's called a pelvic exoneration. That's a really big operation that basically took out everything in the pelvis, the bladder, the vagina, the rectum, the uterus, tubes and ovaries, and you tried to reconstruct all those things in various ways. You took a piece of the intestine to try to create a new bladder. You tried to reconnect the colon to the anus so that you didn't have a colostomy. And typically, most people would do what we call a myocutaneous flap or skin and muscle flap. So it's a real big operation. It took 12 hours or so. And the mortality, in fact, was probably 1 or 2% in those days. In other words, the likelihood that you would die as a result of the operation was 1 to 2%. At any rate, in those days, the fellows at USC LA County were responsible for getting the informed consent from the patient. You had to personally go to the patient and get consent. And as I said, most of the patients spoke Spanish, and there were no translators or anything like that in those days. So you just had to figure it out some way. So I was having to consent this patient for a pelvic exoneration in Spanish. Well, my Spanish was good enough that I could tell her that we were going to take out everything from her waist down. We were going to try to put her back together, and she might die as a result. And of course, her answer was, sí, doctor, sí. And I'm walking out, and her mother, who was there listening to all this, stops me out in the hallway and asks me, well, doctor, thank you for taking care of her, but I guess we'll need to get a wheelchair after she gets out of the hospital. I said, oh, she's going to be here for several weeks, so you don't really need to worry about anything like that. Plus, if she needs it, we'll get her physical therapy, and, so you don't have to worry about that, really. But she said again, but yeah, we'll still need the wheelchair even when she goes home. And we went back and forth on that 2 or 3 times until I finally figured out the mother actually thought we were going to chop the girl in half at like her belly button, and that she would have no more legs. I managed to convince her that was not the case, which relieved her greatly, and that she wouldn't need a wheelchair. So that's about how good my Spanish was at LA County / USC Hospital in Los Angeles. Somebody was asking me about the old emergency room at Charity Hospital in New Orleans, which was, in fact, legendary for all the outrageous things that happened there, not the least of which was some of the characters that tended to show up in the ER. And at the time I was there, back in the 1980s, there were a number of characters who could have been considered frequent flyers, I guess, or regular visitors. to the ER, and they came there for a variety of reasons. There was always a crowd of people in the waiting area for the ER, and you never knew for sure whether they were patients or friends of patients, or they just came in to get out of the rain for a while or something. And in fact, many of them came because the only food available in the facility for consumption was in the mornings. The dining room at breakfast time would take all the leftover eggs and bread for toast and some bacon, even if that was around, and made sandwiches out of them. So they made these egg sandwiches, and they brought them upstairs to the ER and just passed them out whoever was there waiting. So you got an egg sandwich if you happen to be in the ER at the right time. So anyway, people would show up sometimes just to get the egg sandwiches. There's one guy in particular who I remember who was notorious over almost a generation of residents at Charity Hospital. His name was Johnny, and I'll just leave it at that. But anyway, Johnny had chronic asthma they'd had for many years, and he had the ability to wheeze on command. He could make himself start wheezing. So he would do that to get into the ER and say he was having an acute asthma attack so that he could get a egg sandwich. Well, Johnny also knew that the front desk, or the triage desk, was occupied by an intern, because everybody else, all the regulars in the ER, the nurses and more senior doctors, knew who Johnny was, and they would try to keep him from getting back because they knew what he was after. Well, the interns didn't know him. So if they saw him and they listened to him and heard him wheezing, they thought, oh man, this guy's about to stop breathing. We got to get him back right now. So he would get in the ER back room that way. And if he could get in, if he convinced one of the interns at the front desk, triage desk, that he was wheezing acutely, they would bring him in. And once he got past the front door, people would start recognizing him, like the other nurses and doctors would start waving at him, and Johnny would smile and wave all at him again. Say, I got in again, Doc. Hey, baby, how you doing? And they'd wheel Johnny back to where the asthma treatment area, which was in the back of the ER. And he would hang around there and make himself keep wheezing until they brought the egg sandwiches up. Then after he finished his sandwich, no matter where he was in his asthma treatment, they gave him like oxygen and various medications. But no matter where he was, once he finished the egg sandwich, he would make himself stop wheezing and say, okay, I'm ready to go, Doc. And you would go listen to him, and I'll be darned, he didn't have any wheezing anymore. So you had to let him go. And then on the way out, you'd wheel Johnny back out. He'd wave everybody again. Okay, see you all. See you tomorrow. And he'd go right back out the front door. The interesting thing was, I first saw Johnny in 1985. Then when I came back to Tulane after leaving to do my training in California in the early 90s as faculty, it was about 95 or so, I overheard two of our young residents talking about working in the emergency room and seeing this guy who was wheezing all the time. And I listened for a minute or two. I realized they were talking about Johnny. So Johnny had been known to Charity Hospital residents for almost a generation, at least 15 years. So Johnny had a long-term gig going at Charity Hospital, and it was just another one of the characters who happened to show up in the ER at any given time. So the blues doctor and his office staff made it to a country bar in Alabama this week, and one of the most interesting songs we found there was actually spoken only in Spanish. We're going to share that one with you right now.
Gusto tocar guitarra, me gusta cantar el son. Mariachi me acompaña cuando canto mi canción. Gusto tomar mis copas, aguardientes lo mejor. También el tequila blanco, canso sale al sabor. Ay, 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 amor. Ay, mi moneda en mi corazón. Ay, 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 amor. Ay, mi moneda.
And that's about all we have this week. The blues doctor would like to thank his producer and technician and cameraman and significant other, Ms. Beth Robinson, for being willing to record on a moment's notice under trying circumstances. Anyway, as we usually say at this time, please watch next week's podcast, okay? See you later.